Grand Ole Opry legend Stringbean Akeman and his wife were murdered in their home back in 1973.
In the fall of 1973, one of the cruelest nights in country music history unfolded in a small log cabin outside Nashville. David Stringbean Akeman, a beloved Grand Ole Opry star, and his wife Estelle were gunned down in their own home. For years afterward, the man who knew him best on stage and off, Roy Clark, carried the weight of that night with him. Before he passed away, Clark spoke openly about his friend, about the persona the world loved, and about the tragedy that cut it all short. This is the story of Stringbean, told to the memories of the people who loved him, and through the facts that still haunt Ridgetop, Tennessee to this day. David Akeman was born on June 17, 1915, in the rolling hills of Jackson County, Kentucky, a place where survival depended on hard work rather than luck. His family farmed for a living, and like most households in that part of Appalachia, they had little room for extravagance. Every child was expected to contribute, and David grew up understanding that nothing came easy. If a tool broke, you fixed it. If you wanted entertainment, you made it yourself, usually with a song, a story, or a porch full of relatives. It was in that world of homemade fun that David first fell in love with music. He wanted a banjo more than anything, but the family budget simply didn't allow for it. Instead of giving up on the idea, young David built his own version out of a cigar box, a piece of wood, and a few stretched strings. It was rough, and it barely resembled a real instrument, but it let him experiment with rhythm and sound long before he ever held a real thing. Eventually, his persistence paid off in a way that has become part of his legend. He traded 2 chickens for an actual banjo, a deal that probably looked laughable to anyone watching, but one that changed the course of his life. From that day forward, the banjo rarely left his hands. He taught himself to play by ear, spending long hours picking out melodies until the instrument felt like a natural extension of his own body. Just as David was coming into his own as a young man, the Great Depression swept across the country and hit rural Kentucky particularly hard. Banks failed, jobs vanished, and families who were already stretched thin found themselves with almost nothing. The Akeman household felt every bit of that strain, and years later, friends would say that this period left a permanent mark on David's view of money and financial institutions. To help his family get by, David joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, a federal program that put young men to work building roads, planting trees, and maintaining public lands in exchange for wages and steady meals. It was hard, physical labor, but it kept food on the table and gave David a sense of discipline that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It also gave him time, in the evenings and on breaks, to keep working on his banjo playing, sharpening the skill that would eventually take him far beyond Jackson County. By his late teens, David had built a local reputation as a gifted banjo player with a natural sense of comedic timing. He entered talent contests and community gatherings throughout the region, often walking away with prize money and, more importantly, a growing following of people who wanted to hear him play and see him crack jokes between songs. His break came when an established regional performer named Asa Martin noticed him at one of these events. Martin was impressed by the young man's playing, and even more impressed by how easily he made a crowd laugh. He invited David to join his traveling show, giving him his first real taste of professional performance. It was during one of these shows that David got the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career. Introducing him to the audience, Martin blanked on his last name and, looking at his tall, thin frame, blurted out String Beans instead. The crowd loved it, and the name stuck, eventually shortening to simply Stringbean. What started as an on-the-spot say became the identity David would carry through decades of performing. Stringbean's career gained real momentum in the early 1940s when he joined Bill Monroe's band, the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe was in the process of shaping an entirely new sound in American music, and playing alongside him gave Stringbean invaluable experience performing at a professional level and learning from some of the most talented musicians of that era. After his time with Monroe, Stringbean began working more closely with another banjo player and comedian named Grandpa Jones. The two men had an easy chemistry, both on and off stage, built around a shared love of old-time music and light-hearted humor. Their partnership became one of the most enduring friendships in Stringbean's life, one that would later play a devastating role in how his story ended. The true turning point in his career came when Stringbean began appearing regularly at the Grand Ole Opry. For any country performer, An invitation to the Opry stage represented the pinnacle of success, and Stringbean used that platform to fully develop the character audiences would remember him by. He wore oversized shirts, baggy pants cinched absurdly high with suspenders, and an old floppy hat, creating a visual gag before he even picked up his banjo, paired with his playing and his one-liners. That image cemented him as one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in the genre. That reputation only grew when television came calling. Stringbean became a regular face on Hee Haw, the variety show that mixed cornball humor with genuine musical talent, introducing him to an entirely new generation of fans who had never set foot inside the Opry house. On camera, his exaggerated wardrobe and deadpan delivery translated perfectly to the small screen, and he became one of the show's most laughed. A raised eyebrow, a well-timed pause, or a line about how little he trusted modern conveniences was often enough. Fellow cast members frequently noted that off camera, he was every bit as friendly and unassuming as the character he played, which only made him easier for audiences to love. By the early 1970s, Stringbean had become a fixture of American entertainment, recognized in grocery stores and gas stations far from Nashville, even though he never let any of that fame change how he actually lived. In 1945, as the country was adjusting to life after World War II, David married Estelle Stanfill. Those who knew the couple described Estelle as gentle, private, and completely devoted to her husband. She had no interest in the spotlight herself, but she was a constant presence at his side, traveling with him to shows and supporting him through every stage of his career. The couple never had children, but friends often remarked that their bond seemed complete just as it was. Rather than using his growing fame to buy a bigger house or fancier belongings, the couple settled into a modest log cabin in Ridgetop, Tennessee. Their home had a wood stove for heat, a small garden Estelle kept up herself, and a flock of chickens for eggs. Most of their meals came straight from what they grew or raised. To fans who only saw Stringbean under the bright lights of the Opry or on television, this simple, almost old-fashioned lifestyle might have seemed surprising. But for David and Estelle, it was exactly the kind of life they wanted, filled with gardening, hunting, fishing, and quiet evenings once the crowds had gone home. One detail about Stringbean's personal life became something of an open secret in his community. He refused to keep his money in a bank. That distrust traced directly back to his boyhood, when he watched banks collapse and families lose everything they had saved during the Depression. That fear never left him. Even decades later, when he was earning a steady, comfortable income from music and television, instead of using a bank, Stringbean kept large amounts of cash on hand, often carrying money with him and hiding the rest in unusual spots around the cabin. Neighbors and fellow performers had heard the story for years, some placing money behind loose bricks, others insisting he had stuffed bills up inside the chimney or beneath the floorboards. Nobody knew exactly how much truth was in these rumors, but the story spread anyway, painting the modest little cabin in Ridgetop as a place that might be hiding a small fortune. Roy Clark, who considered Stringbean both a colleague and a genuine friend, later spoke about this habit with a mix of affection and sadness. He remembered a man who was generous, funny, and utterly unconcerned with appearances, but also someone who never fully shook the anxieties of a hard childhood. In Clark's recollections, that old fear of losing everything overnight was as much a part of who Stringbean was as his banjo or his comedy routines. It was a harmless quirk for years, right up until it became a fatal one. Clark also remembered how casually Stringbean talked about the subject with people he trusted, almost as if the danger of it never crossed his mind. He wasn't secretive out of malice or paranoia toward the people around him. He simply preferred the certainty of cash he could see and touch over the abstract promise of a bank statement. To Clark, that was part of what made Stringbean so genuine. He never adopted the trappings of wealth or celebrity, and in his own mind, keeping money close to home was no different from keeping tools in the barn or vegetables in the root cellar. What nobody around him fully appreciated at the time was how far word of that habit had traveled, or how many people outside his circle of friends had heard the same rumors and started to see the modest cabin in Ridgetop as an opportunity rather than a home. November 10th, 1973, began as an ordinary Saturday for David and Estelle. Stringbean had a routine he almost never broke: perform at the Grand Ole Opry, then drive back home to Ridgetop with his wife. That night at the Opry was no different from countless others. He played his banjo, delivered his jokes, and left the crowd laughing, with Estelle nearby as always, quietly supporting the way she had for nearly 3 decades. What the couple didn't know was that 2 cousins, John and Marvin Brown, had already broken into their cabin earlier that evening. Both men had long histories of petty crime and had grown increasingly reckless in the months leading up to that night. They had heard the same rumors everyone else in the area had heard, that Stringbean kept a hidden stash of cash somewhere inside his home, and they decided to act on it. The Browns' plan was straightforward and brutal. Wait for the couple to come home, catch them off guard, and search the cabin for money. When Stringbean and Estelle pulled into the driveway close to midnight, they had no idea anyone was waiting inside. David walked in first and was confronted almost immediately. According to the accounts that followed, one of the Browns opened fire, and Stringbean was killed almost instantly near the doorway of his own home. Estelle, hearing the commotion, turned and ran back toward their car, likely hoping to escape or get help. She didn't make it. She was caught and shot just outside, near the vehicle. In a matter of minutes, a quiet, decades-long partnership was violently ended. The morning after the murders, Grandpa Jones arrived at the cabin as planned. He and Stringbean had a standing arrangement to go hunting together, and Jones had no reason to expect anything was wrong. Instead, he found Estelle's body near the car. Panicked, he rushed toward the house and discovered David just inside the doorway. Jones immediately went for help, but the image of that morning stayed with him for the rest of his life. He would later describe it as one of the most painful memories he ever carried, a moment that turned an ordinary hunting trip into the discovery of his closest friend's murder. News of the killing spread through Nashville almost instantly, shocking a community that had never associated Stringbean with anything but warmth and laughter. Fellow musicians, Opry regulars, and longtime fans struggled to reconcile the violence of the crime with the gentle, humble man they thought they knew. In the days that followed, suspicion in the small town of Ridgetop quickly turned toward John and Marvin Brown. Both men were already known to local law enforcement, and it didn't take long for their sudden change in behavior to draw attention. Neighbors noticed the cousins suddenly spending more freely than usual, buying things they normally couldn't afford, and talking carelessly about money. That kind of visible change was hard to hide in a small community where everyone noticed everyone else's business. Locals passed along their suspicions to investigators, who began building a case around the Browns' erratic spending, inconsistent statements, and possession of items traced back to the Akeman home. Combined with the timeline of their movements on the night of the murders, the evidence against them mounted steadily. Investigators also worked to connect physical evidence directly to the 2 men. A handful of items traced back to the Akeman cabin turned up in the Browns' possession, which, combined with their suspicious spending and the timeline of their movements that night, gave police enough to move forward with arrests. Both cousins were taken into custody within weeks of the murders, offering a small measure of relief to a community that had spent those weeks in a state of fear and disbelief, uncertain whether whoever committed the crime might still be nearby. Their trial drew intense attention, not just from the local community, but from country music fans across the nation who wanted to see justice served for a couple so widely respected. Testimony came from multiple directions, including an emotional account from Grandpa Jones about discovering the bodies, and recollections from fellow Opry performers who helped establish Stringbean's routine and final hours. Prosecutors walked the jury through the timeline of that Saturday night step by step, from the couple's departure for the Opry to their return home, and laid out how the Browns had positioned themselves inside the cabin to wait. In the end, John Brown, identified as a shooter, was sentenced to 198 years in prison, a term intended to guarantee he would never be released. Marvin Brown received a lighter sentence, but still spent decades behind bars, eventually dying in prison without ever being released. Even after the killers were caught and convicted, one part of the story remained unresolved. What happened to Stringbean's hidden money? When investigators searched the cabin following the murders, they